When the queen's daughter shed her royal garb, the human stood speechless. Vertical bar HFY Reddit. Daniel had traveled far from Earth to stand in the shining court of the Aurelian Empire. The hall was a masterpiece of crystal and light, with high arches that glowed softly, as if the stars themselves were trapped inside the walls. Every sound echoed, and every gesture was watched by sharp eyes. The Aurelians were known across the galaxy for their elegance and strict order. To them, everything had its place, and every person had a role already written before they were born. In their eyes, humans were a new and curious race, untested, rough around the edges, and far from refined. Daniel knew this well. He had prepared himself for the polite smiles that carried hidden laughter, for the way some Aurelians whispered about his simple clothes and plain face. But he stood tall, reminding himself that he was not here for pride. He had been sent as an envoy, a representative, of a young species that had only recently stepped beyond its home system. His task was to speak for his people, to ask for safe travel routes so that human ships could pass through Aurelian space without risk. It sounded like a small request, but he knew that in a court such as this, every word mattered. The queen of the Aurelians sat on a raised platform, her throne made of silver and glass. Her crown was delicate, almost floating around her head, a symbol of her authority. She was calm, her face unreadable, and her voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Around her stood counselors, guards, and nobles, each one dressed in long flowing robes that shimmered in the light. They looked at Daniel with interest, some with amusement, as though waiting for him to stumble. But Daniel did not stumble. He bowed with respect, careful to follow the customs he had studied, and began to speak. His voice was steady, not too loud, not too soft. He explained why humans sought passage, how they wished for trade and understanding, and how they hoped for friendship rather than rivalry. He spoke not as someone begging for favor, but as someone offering an honest hand. It was during this speech that he noticed her. Standing beside the queen, slightly behind, was the princess. Her name, though he did not yet know it, was Illyra. She was young compared to the others, her face softer, her eyes brighter. While most of the court looked at him with curiosity or cold smiles, her gaze was different. She studied him closely, as if searching for something beyond his words. She tilted her head slightly, her expression neither mocking nor dismissive. For a brief moment, Daniel felt the weight of her attention and almost faltered, but he caught himself and continued. When he finished, the hall was quiet. The queen gave a polite nod, promising that the request would be considered, though her tone carried no promise of agreement. The counselors whispered among themselves, debating in voices too low for him to hear. Daniel stood in silence, waiting, knowing that his role was to show patience. Yet he could feel the princess's gaze, still fixed upon him. Later, as the gathering ended, Daniel was guided to a side chamber where refreshments were offered. The Aurelians served food that sparkled like jewels, drinks that shimmered in their cups. Daniel tasted carefully, not wanting to offend, though the flavors were strange to him. As he stood alone near a window, watching the stars beyond, he heard a soft voice beside him. "You speak differently from the others," the voice said. He turned and saw her, the princess who had been watching him in the hall. Up close, she seemed less distant than the others, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. She wore a crown of fine silver threads, but it was her expression that held his attention. "Do I?" Daniel asked, unsure of what she meant. "You speak as though your words come from your heart," she replied. "Most who stand in that hall speak only to please or to gain power. But you spoke simply. It was refreshing." Daniel felt a small smile tug at his lips. On Earth, we have learned that truth carries farther than flattery. At least we try to believe that. The princess's lips curved in a faint smile of her own. "Earth, I wish to know more about it. It is said your people are young, yet you carry yourselves with boldness. Tell me, is it true that your world has oceans that stretch farther than the eye can see?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, vast waters that Meet the horizon and skies that change their colors with the rising and setting sun. We may not have the oldest empire, but we have beauty that teaches us humility. Her eyes widened slightly at his words, and for a moment, the weight of her royal station seemed to fall away. She looked not like a princess of a mighty empire, but like someone longing to step outside the walls of her life. Before more could be said, another courtier approached, bowing deeply to her and reminding her of her duties. She gave Daniel a final glance, one filled with unspoken questions. Before turning away, Daniel stood alone once more, but the memory of her gaze stayed with him. In that vast and glittering court, filled with voices that spoke in circles, one voice had reached out honestly, and one pair of eyes had met his with something more than curiosity. He did not yet know what it meant, but he felt the beginning of a story unfolding, one that would reach far beyond trade routes and politics, and into the very heart of what it meant to be human. The next morning, Daniel was escorted through the shining corridors of the palace. The walls sparkled with soft light, and patterns like living stars shifted slowly across the ceilings. Servants moved in silence, their steps almost soundless, against the polished floor. Everywhere he went, Daniel felt the eyes of the Aurelians on him. Some looked with curiosity, some with mild amusement, but none with warmth. He reminded himself why he was here. He was not only representing Earth, but also showing that humans could stand as equals among the old powers of the galaxy. Still, he knew his words from the night before had only scratched the surface. If the Queen and her council decided that humans were not worthy of trust, all his efforts would be wasted. Yet, as he walked, Daniel could not stop thinking of the princess. Her eyes had not mocked him, and her voice had not carried the cold distance of the others. She had spoken with interest, even with wonder. 'Twas unusual, and Daniel wondered if he would see her again. His chance came sooner than expected. That afternoon, when the court was busy with other matters, Daniel was guided to the imperial gardens. The garden was unlike anything he had ever seen. Crystal trees glowed softly with pale colors, their branches twisting like glass. Pools of water shimmered with silver light, and flowers opened and closed as though breathing with the rhythm of the stars above. He paused to admire it, forgetting for a moment the weight of diplomacy. "You look amazed," a gentle voice said. Daniel turned, and there she was, the princess. Elira was dressed in lighter robes than before, not weighed down by jewels or crowns. She looked freer, more natural, and her expression was curious rather than formal. "It is beautiful," Daniel admitted. "I have seen many gardens on Earth, but nothing like this. It feels alive, as though the stars themselves planted it." Elira smiled faintly. "It was planted long ago by our ancestors, as a reminder of the order we value. Every tree, every flower, is placed according to strict design. Nothing here grows wild. That is the way of our people." Daniel tilted his head. "It is perfect, yes. But on Earth we let gardens grow in their own way. Flowers mix with one another. Trees bend where the wind takes them, and sometimes it looks messy. But that is part of the beauty. We do not always try to control it." Her eyes lingered on him, thoughtful. "You speak as though there is strength in chaos." "Not chaos," Daniel corrected gently. "Freedom. When things grow freely, they surprise you. They create beauty no one planned. People are like that too." For a moment, Elira was silent. She looked around at the perfect shapes of the crystal trees, then back at Daniel. "You make it sound appealing. Yet, in my world, freedom is not given. From the moment of birth, we are told who we must be. A daughter of the Queen is not allowed to wonder what else she might become. My path is already chosen." Daniel saw the flicker of sadness in her eyes, a feeling carefully hidden behind her calm expression. He understood it, though he could not imagine living under such heavy expectations. "On Earth," he said softly, "we believe every person should be allowed to choose. We stumble, we fail, but in those failures we learn who we are. It is not easy, but it is real." Her gaze softened as she studied him. You truly believe that? I do, Daniel answered. Dot. They walked together through the garden, the silence, between them not uncomfortable but filled with unspoken thoughts. Elira asked him about Earth, about the oceans he had mentioned, about the music and the stories of his people. Daniel told her of waves crashing against cliffs, of storms rolling over forests, of songs sung by voices untrained yet full of heart. He told her how humans painted with colors that did not follow rules, how they danced without steps, and how they dreamed of reaching stars not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Elira listened with quiet wonder, as though each word gave her a glimpse of a life she had never known. For her, raised in duty and tradition, the idea of choice seemed like a distant star, beautiful, unreachable, yet calling to her. As the sun of her world began to set, the crystal garden glowed in new colors, deep blues and soft golds. Elira stopped and turned to Daniel. You are different from the others who come here. Most bow, flatter, and hide their thoughts. But you speak with honesty. It is strange, yet refreshing. Daniel gave a small smile. Maybe that is all I have to offer. Humans do not yet have the power of great empires, but we have honesty and we have hope. Perhaps that is enough. Her eyes lingered on him, and for the first time Daniel saw a spark of something more than curiosity. It was longing, a wish for something beyond her life of crowns and duty. But before either could speak further, a group of attendants appeared, bowing deeply to her. They reminded her of her next obligation, and the moment between them broke. Elira straightened, her royal mask sliding back into place, though her eyes still held warmth as she looked at him. Thank you for your words, Daniel of Earth. Perhaps one day I will see these oceans you speak of. She walked away, her attendants following closely, leaving Daniel alone in the glowing garden. He stood there, feeling the silence around him, and realized something had changed. He had come here to speak of trade routes and safe passage, but now something else had begun, something unexpected, fragile, and powerful. Daniel was not called to the court the next day. Instead, he was told to remain in his guest quarters within the palace walls. The chambers given to him were elegant, far beyond anything he had ever known on Earth. The ceiling was high, shaped, like the inside of a dome, and light fell from it as though stars had been captured and placed above his head. The furniture was carved from shining crystal, smooth and cool to the touch, and the air itself carried a faint fragrance of flowers. From the gardens. Yet, for all the beauty, Daniel felt restless. He was not used to sitting in silence, waiting for others to decide his future. On Earth, he had lived by his own effort, shaping his days with work and choice. Here, in the Empire's heart, he was forced to play a part in a story written by others. He walked to the window and stared out at the towers of the palace rising like spears of glass against the pale sky. Somewhere among those towers was Princess Elira, and the memory of her words in the garden stayed with him. When night came, a soft knock sounded at his door. Daniel turned, expecting a servant, but when he opened it, he found her. Elira stood, there cloaked in a simple robe without her crown or jewels, her hair falling freely around her shoulders. For a moment, Daniel could only stare, surprised that she had come alone. I should not be here, she said quietly, her voice carrying both caution and determination. But I wish to speak with you again. Daniel stepped aside and she entered the chamber. The glow from the ceiling lights caught her face, making her appear less like a princess and more like someone young and curious, searching for answers. You risk much by coming here, Daniel said gently. Elira nodded. Yes, but I have questions, and no one in this palace will answer them honestly. You will? He smiled faintly. If I can. She moved to the window, looking out at the endless towers. All my life, I have been told that my duty is to serve the Empire, to wear the crown when my mother steps aside, to rule with strength and with order. It is an honor, they say, the greatest of honors. Yet, She paused, her voice softening. It feels like a cage made of light. Beautiful, unbreakable, and forever closed. Daniel listened carefully. He did not interrupt, for he could hear the weight in her words. She turned back to him, her eyes searching his. You told me of freedom, of choice. But how can a person choose when their every step has been decided before birth? Tell me, Daniel of Earth, what does it mean to be free? The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Daniel thought carefully before answering. Freedom, he said slowly, is not the absence of duty. It is the right to decide which duty you accept. It is the chance to shape your own path even if it leads you into failure. On Earth, we make mistakes every day, but each mistake teaches us who we are. Without the power to choose, even mistakes, life becomes only a performance. Illyra's gaze did not leave him. And you believe such a life is worth the chaos it brings? Yes, Daniel said firmly. Because a life without choice may look perfect, but it does not belong to the person living it. It belongs to those who built the cage. For a long time, Illyra was silent. Then slowly she pulled the clasp from her robe and let it fall open. Beneath it she wore a simple dress of pale fabric, nothing like the heavy gowns of ceremony. She lifted her arms slightly, as if showing herself. This is who I am beneath the layers of duty. Not the crown, not the robes, not the role they gave me. Just Illyra. Daniel felt his breath catch, not because of the sight, but because of the courage it took. In that moment, she was not the queen's daughter, not the voice of the empire, but a person daring to reveal herself. You are brave, he said softly. She shook her head. No, I am frightened. But I do not want to live all my years wondering what it would have been like to step outside the cage. Daniel stepped closer, his voice gentle. On Earth, we say the first step toward freedom is the hardest. After that, each step becomes easier. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. Then perhaps I have taken my first step tonight. The moment stretched between them, fragile as glass yet unbreakable in its meaning. For the first time in her life, Illyra had spoken as herself, not as a symbol of her people. And for Daniel, it was the first sign that his mission in the empire was about more than trade routes or political agreements. Something greater was unfolding, something that reached beyond politics, beyond crowns, into the heart of what it meant to be alive. Outside the window, the towers of the palace gleamed under the pale light of the moon. Inside, two figures stood, in silence, one a princess learning to shed her royal mask, the other a human learning that his presence might change more than he had ever expected. The day of celebration came quickly, and the entire palace seemed alive with movement. Servants hurried through the halls, carrying trays of shining ornaments and flowing robes. Musicians tuned their instruments, their notes echoing faintly against the crystal walls. Courtiers whispered in excited tones about which noble houses would attend and how the queen's daughter would appear before them all. For Daniel, it was the first time he would witness a true imperial ceremony, and though he had no role to play in it, he was invited as a guest of honor. When he entered the grand hall, he found it transformed. Light poured down from the high ceilings, refracted by hidden crystals so that colors rippled across the room like living rainbows. The floor shone like a mirror, reflecting the guests who gathered in long, flowing robes. Everywhere he looked, Aurelians moved with practiced grace, their voices calm, their steps carefully measured. They seemed like a painting brought to life, every detail perfect and controlled. At the far end of the hall sat the queen on her throne, regal and still. She wore a crown that seemed to float above her head and robes that shimmered like starlight. Around her stood the counselors and nobles of the empire, each one marked with symbols of their station. Yet even with all the splendor, the eyes of the court were waiting for one figure. The princess. Daniel stood quietly near the edge of the crowd, feeling the weight of the occasion. He reminded himself that this ceremony was not about him, that he was only an observer. Still, a strange anticipation stirred in him, as though he already knew this night would leave a mark on his memory. At last, the doors opened, and silence fell across the hall. Princess Elira entered, her steps light yet steady, her face calm but distant. She wore layers of royal garb that seemed almost impossible to carry, flowing silks, jewels that glittered with every movement, and a crown woven of silver threads. Her dress trailed behind her like a river of light, and her arms were adorned with delicate bands of crystal. To anyone watching, she appeared the perfect image of an imperial heir. Untouchable, flawless, almost otherworldly. The nobles bowed. As she passed, their voices rising in praise, their gestures rehearsed. Daniel, too, bowed with respect, but his eyes lingered on her face. Behind the glitter and perfection, he saw something others might not notice. Her gaze was calm, but not joyful. Her lips were curved in the practiced smile of royalty, but her eyes carried a quiet sorrow. She walked as though her steps belonged to tradition, not to her. The ceremony unfolded with speeches, music, and the exchange of gifts from visiting houses. Daniel listened politely, though the words seemed to him more performance than meaning. The Aurelians praised order, honor, and the strength of their traditions, yet he could not forget the garden, where Elira had spoken of longing for freedom. Now she stood before the empire in garments that seemed to weigh down her very spirit. When her turn to speak came, the hall grew quiet once again. Elira stepped forward, her voice clear and even, each word carefully shaped. She spoke of duty to the empire, of loyalty to her mother, of the honor of serving her people. The crowd listened with admiration, and when she finished, they applauded with great enthusiasm. To them, she had shown the perfect image of a future queen. But Daniel knew the truth hidden beneath the performance. He could still see the flicker of sadness in her eyes, the way her shoulders straightened, not from pride, but from obligation. He felt a strange ache in his chest, not for himself, but for her. She was surrounded by praise and honor, yet she stood alone, carrying a crown that felt more like a chain. As the celebration continued, Daniel remained at a distance, yet his thoughts stayed fixed on Elira. He noticed how she moved from guest to guest, her words polite, her laughter soft but practiced. She greeted noble after noble, bowing, smiling, and offering words she did not seem to feel. It was a flawless performance, and no one else seemed to see beyond it. Only once did her mask slip. As she turned from a group of nobles, her gaze swept across the hall and met Daniel's. For a heartbeat, her practiced smile faltered, and her eyes softened with recognition. In that single glance, he felt the truth. She was tired, she was longing, and she wished to be seen not as a princess but as herself. Then quickly the mask returned, and she moved on. The night stretched long, filled with music and speeches, yet Daniel felt little joy in it. The hall might have glittered with beauty, but he could not forget the weight pressing down on the young woman who stood at its center. When the celebration finally ended and the nobles began to leave, he caught a last glimpse of her as she walked toward the queen's private chambers. Her back was straight, her steps measured, her figure draped in jewels. But he could not stop thinking of the girl who had stood in the garden, speaking of freedom, dressed in nothing but her own quiet courage. Daniel left the hall with a heavy heart. He realized now that his mission in this empire had become more complicated than any treaty or trade route. Somewhere within the glittering walls of tradition was a single voice, longing for freedom. And perhaps, just perhaps, that voice had found in him someone who would listen. The palace was quiet after the celebration, its long corridors filled only with the faint hum of hidden lights. Daniel walked back to his chambers slowly, his mind heavy with the image of Elira in her royal garb. To the court she had been flawless, but to him she had looked like someone trapped in a costume too heavy to carry. He could not forget the sadness in her eyes, the fleeting glance she had given him, the silent plea hidden behind it. He thought sleep might not come, yet as he lay down beneath the soft glow of the ceiling lights, he drifted into uneasy dreams. In them, he saw the princess standing in a garden of crystal trees, her crown falling into the water, her robes melting into the air, leaving her bare of titles and duty. She looked at him with eyes full of longing. But when he reached for her, she disappeared like mist. Daniel woke with a start, his chest tight, unsure if the dream had been only his imagination or a message from his own restless heart. The next night he heard a soft sound at his door once again. Rising quickly, he opened it. And there she was. Princess Elira stood with her hood drawn low, her hands folded in front of her. She slipped inside without a word, closing the door behind her. For a moment she said nothing, only paced the room with quick steps, her robe whispering against the crystal floor. "I could not breathe," she said at last, her voice breaking the silence. "All day, they praised me. They said I was perfect, flawless, the image of what an heir should be. But every word felt like a stone laid upon my chest. I could not breathe beneath it." Daniel's heart tightened. He stepped closer, speaking gently. "You carried yourself with strength, Elira. No one saw your pain but me. That takes courage." She stopped pacing and looked at him with sudden intensity. "But I do not want courage only to keep pretending. I want courage to be myself." Her voice trembled as she reached for the clasp at her shoulder. "I want you to see me. Not as a princess, not as the daughter of a queen, but as the person I truly am." Before Daniel could speak, she pulled the robe away and let it fall to the floor. One by one, she loosened the jeweled bands from her arms, slipping them off with quick, determined movements. The silver crown was lifted from her head and placed gently upon the table. Finally, she drew back the layers of heavy fabric until she stood before him in a simple dress, plain and light, the kind any woman might wear if she were free to walk the streets without title or duty. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had thought her beautiful before, draped in silk and crystal, but this was different. He was not speechless because of her appearance, but because of her courage. She stood unadorned, stripped of the image the Empire demanded, and in that simplicity she was more radiant than any crown could make her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was deep, filled with meaning. Finally, Daniel found his voice. "You are Elira," he said softly, as though the name itself was new. Her lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes glistening. "Yes, just Elira. Not princess, not a heir, not the voice of the Empire. Only myself." Daniel nodded slowly, still struggling to find words. "And that is more than enough." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "When I wear the robes, they say I am strong, untouchable. But inside, I feel small, as though I do not belong to myself. Only now, without them, do I feel real." "You are real," Daniel assured her. "The garb does not make you who you are. You are more than the role they placed on your shoulders." Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them. "Do you know what it feels like to live every moment as someone else's vision? To walk paths chosen by others, to speak words written for you? I have never known the sound of my own voice until I spoke to you." Daniel felt a swell of emotion in his chest. On Earth, we believe each life belongs first to the person living it. A crown may be placed on your head, but your heart remains your own. No one can take that unless you give it away. Her eyes softened, and for a moment she seemed younger, free of the weight she carried. "Then tonight, I am not a princess. Tonight I am only Elira." Daniel gave a small smile. "And tonight I am only Daniel, not an envoy, not a representative of Earth, just myself." They stood together in silence, two people stripped of their titles, facing one another honestly, for the first time. The room seemed smaller, quieter, as though the walls themselves held their secret. Outside, the moonlight painted the towers in pale silver, but within the chamber, a softer light glowed, the light of truth, shared between two souls. At last, Elira bent down and picked up the crown she had set aside. She held it in her hands, staring at it as though it were both precious and heavy. Then she placed it back on the table and turned to Daniel once more. "I do not know what will come of this. My life is bound by duty, yet my heart longs for freedom. Perhaps it is foolish to hope, but tonight I have taken one step closer to it. Daniel met her gaze with quiet strength. Hope is never foolish. It is the first step to change. And so they stood together, a princess without her royal garb and a human far from his homeworld, both bound by the same truth, that beyond crowns, beyond duties, beyond the weight of expectation, there was something greater waiting to be discovered. The days after their secret meeting passed slowly for Elira. She went through the duties expected of her, listening to counselors, greeting nobles, sitting beside her mother in the court. Each time, she wore the robes of her station, heavy and glittering, and each time she felt the same weight pressing down. Yet deep inside, something had changed. The memory of standing in Daniel's chamber without her royal garb, speaking as herself, remained with her like a quiet flame dot. When she found a chance, she sought him again. This time, it was in the garden at dusk. The crystal trees glowed softly, their light shifting as the sun sank behind the palace towers. Daniel was already there, waiting, his figure outlined against the shining pools. He turned when he heard her steps, and his expression softened with warmth. "You came," he said quietly. "I had to," she answered. "I cannot keep these thoughts locked inside me any longer." They walked side by side along a path lined with glowing flowers. For a while neither spoke. The silence filled only with the faint hum of the garden. At last, Elira stopped and faced him. Her voice was low, but steady. "I dream of leaving all of this behind, of stepping beyond these walls, beyond this empire, into the stars. I want to walk on worlds I have never seen, to breathe air that has never touched this palace, to feel who I am without the crown pressing against me." "Is that foolish?" Daniel shook his head. "No, that is human." Her brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" He looked toward the sky, where the first stars of night appeared. "On Earth, we were never told the universe belonged to us. We were small, fragile, trapped on one world. Yet we dreamed of more. We dreamed of walking on the moon, of reaching the far planets, of sailing among the stars. We chased those dreams, not because we were ordered to, but because something inside us refused to be satisfied with cages no matter how beautiful. That is why I say it is human, to long for more even when others call it impossible." Her eyes grew thoughtful. "Then perhaps I share something with your people more than I thought, for I long for more too. But how can I take it when every eye in this palace waits for me to play my role? If I step away, it will not only shame me, it will shake the empire." Daniel's voice was calm, but firm. "Maybe shaking the empire is what it needs. You told me your people value order, perfection, tradition, but even the strongest stone breaks if it never changes. Without change, no life can grow. You see the truth. That makes you stronger than they realize." Elira lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around each other. "Strength. I do not always feel it. At times, I feel like a bird with wings folded tight, staring at the sky it cannot reach." Daniel stepped closer, his voice gentle. "But the wings are still there. One day you can choose to open them." Her eyes lifted to his, shining with unspoken emotion. "And if I fall? Then you will rise again," he said. "That is what it means to be free. To fall, to rise, to choose, again and again until you find the path that is yours." For a long moment they stood in silence, the garden glowing softly around them. Elira felt her heart pounding, not with fear, but with something new, hope. Daniel's words did not erase her doubts, but they gave her a vision she had never dared imagine, a life shaped by her own hand, not by the weight of a crown. "I wish I could see Earth," she whispered, "to stand beside the oceans you spoke of, to hear the songs of your people. Perhaps there I could learn what it truly means to be free." Daniel's smile was faint, but filled with quiet conviction. "Perhaps one day you will. But freedom does not begin on Earth or here in the palace. It begins inside you. It begins the moment you choose to claim it." Her breath caught as she realized the truth of his words. For so long she had believed freedom was something beyond her reach, something locked away by her birth. But now she saw it differently. It was not a gift to be granted by her mother or her people. It was a choice, one she alone could make. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. An attendant appeared at the edge of the garden, bowing deeply. "Princess, the queen requests your presence." Elira's expression shifted, the mask of duty settling once again over her features. Yet before she turned, she looked at Daniel, her eyes speaking what her lips could not. She had not chosen yet, but she was closer. When she walked away, Daniel remained in the garden, staring at the glowing trees. He knew her struggle would not end easily. Tradition was strong, and the crown weighed heavily. But he also knew something had begun in her heart that could not be undone. She had tasted the thought of freedom, and once tasted it could never be forgotten. The day of the grand assembly arrived, and the palace shimmered with light. Nobles and leaders from every province filled the vast hall, their robes glittering with jewels, their faces calm and proud. The air carried the weight of tradition, every sound echoing against the tall crystal walls. At the center stood the throne of the queen, bright as the sun, and beside it, the place reserved for her daughter Elira, walked slowly down the path of light, her steps graceful, her royal garb gleaming. Every eye followed her. To them, she was the jewel of the empire, the perfect heir, the one who would keep their order unbroken. Yet beneath the heavy robes, her heart beat with a rhythm that was no longer quiet. Daniel's words lingered in her mind. Freedom begins when you choose. She bowed before her mother and took her place. The queen rose and lifted her hand. "Today," the queen declared, her voice ringing clear, "we show the strength of our empire. We prove our unity, our unshaken tradition. And we look to the future with my daughter, your princess, who shall continue our legacy." The hall thundered with applause. Elira felt the sound pressing against her like a storm. For a moment she almost bowed her head, almost played the part. But then, she remembered the garden at dusk, the quiet flame inside her, the vision of skies unchained. She drew a breath and let it fill her with courage. When the hall grew silent again, she stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled beneath her sleeves. "People of the empire, my mother speaks of unity and tradition, but I must speak of truth. For too long I have stood as a symbol and not as myself. Today, I cannot pretend any longer." A murmur rippled through the hall. The queen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained silent. Watching her daughter Elira raised her hands and, with slow grace, unclasped the heavy robe at her shoulders. The jeweled fabric slid away, pooling at her feet. Gasps filled the air, as she stood in simple attire, free of the symbols of royalty. Her voice carried clearly, each word like a spark. "I am more than the crown. I am not only your princess. I am a person who dreams, who questions, who longs to choose her own path. If I must serve this empire, then let it be not as a caged heir, but as a free being, true to myself." The silence that followed was vast, filled with disbelief. Some nobles shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. Others frowned, whispering in alarm. Yet in the back rows, where the common citizens were allowed to stand, something different stirred. They leaned forward, eyes wide, hope flickering like a flame newly lit. The queen slowly rose from her throne. Her gaze was sharp, unreadable, as she studied her daughter. At last, she spoke, her tone calm but heavy with meaning. "You cast aside the garb of royalty before all. Do you understand what this means?" Elira lifted her chin. "It means I choose to be honest. It means I will not live in silence. If I am to lead one day, it will not be with chains around my soul. It will be with open eyes, with freedom as my guide." The hall shook with divided voices. Some cried out in outrage, demanding she be punished for breaking tradition. Others, though fewer, raised their voices in support, inspired by her courage. The sound was chaotic, the old order trembling for the first time in centuries. Through it all, Daniel stood at the edge of the hall among the servants, his heart pounding. He had not known what she would choose, but now, seeing her stand so boldly, he felt awe. She was no longer only a princess trapped by duty. She was a spark that could change everything. The queen raised her hand and the noise quieted. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes locked with her daughter's. Then with a slow nod, she spoke. Very well. If you would cast aside the robes, then let the people see you as you are. Let them judge. The path you choose will not be easy, but it is yours. May the Empire be strong enough to endure it. Elira bowed her head, not in defeat, but in gratitude. She had spoken her truth, and though the future was uncertain, she no longer felt the cage around her heart. That night, as the stars shone above the palace, she walked quietly to the garden where Daniel waited. When he saw her, his eyes lit with pride. You did it, he said softly. I began, she answered. The road ahead will be long, but I am no longer afraid. Whatever comes, I will walk it as myself, not as the mask they gave me. Daniel smiled. That is the first step to freedom. And once taken, there is no turning back. They stood together. Beneath the glowing trees, the night filled with quiet promise. The Empire would change, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. And at its heart would be the princess who dared to shed her garb and the human who stood speechless, yet inspired.